Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your hosts, Chris Jennings and Dr. Mike Brasher.
Joining me again today is my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well. Chris, how you doing?
Great, doing great. Okay, so we are going to continue with our species-specific series here, and this specific species I'm pretty excited about because it's one of my favorite species, the green-winged teal. Mike, you want to provide just a little bit of an intro to the green-winged teal before we get into the details?
I sure will. This is a pretty neat little bird here. I was commenting here before we started. There's a lot of neat aspects to it. It's just always pretty cool little bird to talk about. The American green-winged teal, let's kind of start there and guess rotate into a little bit of the taxonomy. It is, there are two subspecies, you could say, of green-winged teal, the American green-winged teal and then I guess the Eurasian green-winged teal. The American green-winged teal is Anas creca carolinensis, and then the Eurasian green-winged teal is Anas creca creca. So there's some debate about whether those should be two distinct species, but right now they're just sort of recognized. Most people acknowledge them as two subspecies. The green-winged teal is the smallest of our dabbling ducks. It coming in at about a half a pound to maybe a pound on a good day. It has a pretty wide distribution. I know we'll get into that a little bit later on. One of the other things that I'll say here as I walk down to the studio, I stopped by that map, that sort of old 1930s map showing each of the species from back in the day when it has their scientific name on it. And I've referenced it in a few other episodes talking about the red-legged black duck. I'm talking about the poster where we got that reference. On that poster, the green-winged teal is identified in the genus Nettion, Nettion. So yet another one of these species that's kind of gone through some different taxonomic classification. The green-winged teal is a pretty neat little bird to talk about it. Obviously, it's we have, within Ducks Unlimited, adopted the green wing as sort of our moniker for our youth, our green wings. And that's, of course, because it's a neat little bird and the smallest duck of any that we have here smallest dabbling duck, I should say, that we have here in North America.
You know, one thing that's interesting about the green-winged teal that I would like to point out is very rarely do waterfowl hunters misidentify the green-winged teal. It's a very obvious bird. Now, you know, you can get into some appearance, specifics, but the male obviously is very obvious. The drake's plumage, especially as you get later in the winter, is very obvious. But the hen is kind of it's a very drab, but that green wing is very obvious as well. So that's something that's interesting. That there's a lot of species that are misidentified, and we've had that discussion in another podcast. But this one is not one of those. So it's very obvious for people.
Yeah, you're right. And so if you don't know what a green-winged teal looks like, go look it up. We're not going to try to do a whole lot of description of it other than, the male during its breeding plumage has that bright cinnamon head and has that green sort of crescent teardrop shape starting at the front of the eye and then kind of tapering back to the neck. And the iridescent green speculum that's present on both the males and the females. Interestingly, one of the sort of physical appearance differences between the subspecies that I referenced, that the American green-winged teal has this white vertical stripe towards the front of the body, sort of on its not really its flank, but sort of on its side. The subspecies in Europe lacks that white vertical bar. So one of the other very distinct markings on green-winged teal, the males anyway, is that triangular cream-shaped, cream-colored marking towards the rump on the sides. It's very, very distinct. A very stark black rump on the male, but that has that cream-colored triangle there on the side of the rump. Pretty cool-looking little distinct mark.
Yeah, and you also threw out a little fun fact that the green-winged teal is one of the only species that can scratch while it's flying, and I found that to be very interesting.
Allegedly so. I do a bit of reading leading up to some of these to try to locate some of those fun facts. Also, just to make sure that I don't mess something up when I'm talking about these species. And yeah, that was a nugget that came out in a couple of places. It's the only duck species that has been observed in flight to scratch, and I think it was scratching. Sounds like multiple observations of that occurrence, and presumably scratching something off its bill, maybe leeches or something of that nature.
That's pretty cool.
I don't know if that's just an observational bias thing or if that is really just the only species that has that unique skill.
Now you can impress everyone in the duck line when green wings fly by and you're like, did you know?
Did you see that one scratching its bill?
Did you know that thing can scratch its bill while it's flying? That's pretty awesome. Let's get into distribution here, Mike. One thing that, everyone throughout the country pretty much is familiar with green-winged teal because of this species' very wide distribution. Let's talk about that a little bit.
We will start out with breeding distribution. It is another one of these species that's largely northern hemispheric. You might find a few down in the southern hemisphere during winter, but for the most part, their entire life cycle is in the northern hemisphere. They occur both in North America as well as Eurasia. They breed in northern latitudes. They are most abundant in the boreal forest regions and Alaska. And this, around the globe, circumpolar. They are in those northern latitudes and really have an affinity for the boreal forest. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 55 to 70% of their breeding population, at least based on the numbers that we have here in North America, will occur every year in the boreal forest. That includes the western boreal forest, eastern boreal forest, and portions of Alaska as well. And then the remaining 30 to whatever it would be, 45% are going to occur in the prairies and prairie parklands and a few other areas, the other breeding regions. And that's going to depend on drought and all that kind of stuff, habitat conditions in those regions. So that's their breeding distribution. And winter distribution, migration distribution is going to be pretty much across North America. There are going to be some hot spots, and we'll talk about those, but there's about 10% of the population that will continue south and winter in Mexico. Their greatest concentrations are going to be in the Mississippi Flyway, a good chunk in the Pacific Flyway and Central Flyway, and then a smaller number in the Atlantic Flyway. That's their general distribution. They are I guess the takeaway there, if people want to take away some key piece of information regarding this species, it's just their close tie to the boreal forest.
Yeah, I always found it pretty interesting that these are, one of the smallest species, yet they're willing to go. They're hardy, I guess I should say. They're going up into areas that, they're breeding in areas where it could potentially be really cold. And they hold out. I mean, they're not afraid to stick around. You see them in icy conditions during hunting season, things like that. I mean, these are some pretty durable birds. But let's kind of transition into that spring migration and, what these birds are doing. They're leaving the wintering grounds, heading back to the breeding grounds. I'm trying to paint you the picture here so you can kind of get what I'm aiming for. As that process goes through, let's talk about, everything from, their nest site selection to pairing, things like that. So let's talk about that process as these birds return north to their breeding grounds.
Green wings are pretty unique and interesting because of their small size. And I can't explain every bit of why they do certain things differently than others, but they're the smallest dabbling duck, right? They're even smaller than a blue-winged teal. But then you look at the migration strategy of a blue-winged teal, and you would think typically that, all right, these smaller-bodied birds are not going to be able to withstand the rigors of a very cold winter quite as well as a larger-bodied bird. And so naturally you would ask the question, well, why the heck do green wings have different migration strategies than a blue wing? They're even smaller than a blue wing. And I think our best understanding of that is going to relate to their ability to rely more on plant-based foods, and as well as they even here in modern times they do engage in a bit of field feeding, corn, rice, maybe not a whole lot of dry field feeding in rice. But certainly in corn, the Texas Panhandle, Southern High Plains, there's been a lot of documentation of green wings field feeding in there. So they do have a bit more flexible diet than do blue wings. That's going to be one of the biggest difference, where we consider blue wings as a sort of an obligate wetland forager. They're obligated, they're sort of to forage in wetlands just because of the way they've evolved. So they have to be a bit more sensitive to the freezing potential for wetlands to freeze. So anyway, that's a bit of an aside there in terms of some distinction on the migration between teal. Green wings tend to have, in stark contrast to blue wings, a more protracted, a more drawn-out migration, both in spring and in fall. They will initiate spring migration as early as February and March, kind of working their way back north. They typically arrive on the breeding grounds April and May. Of course, earlier in some of those southern areas, that's all just kind of natural to expect. And let's see, when do they arrive? So they arrive in April and May, and then you'll see them start breeding around that time as well. And in terms of nest site selection, when they go north into the boreal forest, you're going to find them nesting in sedges, in rushes, typically very close to wetlands. That's one of the unique things. I shouldn't say unique things, but it's an interesting fact about them. A lot of the studies that you look at report finding these nests within 20 meters, 50 meters, 100 meters of a wetland. Now, when they nest in the prairies, I think that holds as well. They tend to nest close to wetlands. Not exactly certain about that, but I know from the boreal forest, that's what some of the literature says. In the prairies, they will nest in grasses or under shrubs, and they're an upland nester. I think should be obvious based on that description, like most other dabbling ducks. And the other thing about them that I've kind of learned, if you look through the literature, the green-winged teal are relatively understudied. Now, they have been encountered, nests of green-winged teals are oftentimes encountered in any kind of study of nesting ducks in the prairies or boreal forests, but their nests occur at really low densities. And apparently, they are also one of the most well-concealed nests of all dabbling ducks, ground nesting dabbling ducks, which results in very small sample sizes from some of these studies. You can look at some studies that report that are sort of indiscriminate in terms of what kind of duck nest they're trying to find. And they'll find 2,000 duck nests or 3,000 duck nests over this study doing typical nest searching methods. About half of those, 40 to 50% of those, will be blue wings, but then maybe 1 to 1.5% will be green wings.
Yeah.
So some of the nesting data, breeding ecology data, nesting ecology data on green wings is a bit sparse compared to some others. So,
but I think that's kind of like, almost like all of these boreal focused species seem to have that in common, just in the fact that it's really, and we've talked with Fritz Reed about this, it's really difficult to get into these vast boreal forests and to pinpoint a handful of green wing nests in a 50 million square mile forest. So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind for our listeners is just that these birds they breed in places that typically, not all of them, but a lot of them breed in places that are extremely hard to access.
Yeah, you're right. You're definitely right about that. I think the pattern for this species still holds, though, because if you have about 30 to 40 to 50% of them breeding in the prairies, you would expect to be able to find more nests than what they typically do in some of these. Now, it may be that they're just not searching the right areas or something of that nature. But anyway, the point is you would think for a bird as abundant as it is, that we would have a little more data on the nesting ecology of it. And so anyway, that's another little tidbit. One thing that I should probably back up on, because I'm trying to think forward here, and I don't know when I'd be able to point this out, but pair formation, timing of pair formation in this species. I've mentioned for blue-winged teal, one of the reasons why they one of the reasons why they don't pair until spring, and then even sometimes once they arrive on the breeding grounds, is going to relate to their smaller body size and just the limited gain that they would realize by pairing early. If from a female's perspective, being able to have that male defending her, allowing her to forage more efficiently and pack on fat and transport it back to the breeding ground. Smaller ducks have limited ability to do that. So green-winged teal also pair relatively late. Not as late as blue wings, but they do pair a little bit later, especially among the dabbling ducks. Pair formation in Louisiana, some studies documented it occurring in January. But then there have been a few other studies that say they documented pairing as early as December, maybe late November. So there's variation all across the board here, but I think as a general rule, these birds are going to pair a little bit later. That's going to relate to some of the just lack of evolutionary advantage of a small bird pairing that early. So they arrive on the breeding grounds in April, May. Nesting starts in May. Mean hatch date, when you look across a number of areas, going to be somewhere around mid-June. Renesting for this species, they do renest, but not as prolifically as mallards. So they don't renest as prolifically as mallards. And one thing that I haven't mentioned on either the previous two episodes, but we don't typically see what's known as double brooding in ducks, basically meaning that if they won't produce more than one brood, they will renest more than once if their nest is destroyed in early incubation. But once they hatch a clutch of eggs and start and take that brood into a wetland, if they lose that brood, it's very rare. And I don't know how many times it's been documented, but not very many at all, where they would actually go back, nest again, and pull off another.
So if
brood.
the nest is destroyed, they will re-nest. But if they hatch that brood, march them to a wetland, and then they're eaten by a snapping turtle or whatever, they typically don't re-nest.
It's going to be less likely. And I guess the distinction I should try to make there is when I say double brooding, the truest sense of double brooding is like raising two broods to fledging or nearly to fledging. That is very, very rare. It's probably not too uncommon if you lose a brood like early in the first few days or week, that maybe early in the summer, hen may try to renest. I don't know how common that would be in green wings. But anyway, just a little bit of an aside there on general nesting ecology, breeding ecology of waterfowl, something we may get into later on a dedicated episode.
So let's go once this hen is on the nest. What is the typical clutch size? And how long does it take? It's something that we always get questions about the mallard, which we address. How long are these birds on the nest until these eggs are hatched? And what are they doing once they're hatched?
Average clutch size for green wings is somewhere between 8 and 9, probably closer to 9 early on those first nest. Another general rule with each subsequent nest that is laid during the summer, renesting, the clutch size, the terminal clutch size is going to decrease. But for those first nest, average is going to be somewhere around 8.5 or 9. You can't lay half an egg, so let's just say 9.
You can, I guess.
Incubation period for this species has been documented somewhere around 20 to 23 days. Like all dabbling ducks, diving ducks. We'll have to exclude whistling ducks from this. We'll exclude swans and geese. But for dabbling and diving ducks, it's only the female that incubates. You get into whistling ducks, and both male and female will incubate. The female spends about 80% of the day incubating once she gets to that stage. And the same thing applies with green wings as it does with the others, where during that laying stage, they're laying about 1 egg a day. They will, once they hatch, they will fledge in 25 to 35 days. That's among the shortest fledging period for dabbling ducks, for any dabbling duck species. Nest success for this species is going to be, as we understand it, fairly low, similar to other ground nesting ducks. They breed at 1 year of age, like most other dabbling ducks and diving ducks. You get into the sea ducks and some of the other long-lived birds, and you'll see them delay breeding until maybe the second year. They, in terms of the wetlands they use, nothing too special there. Pretty much the same as a lot of the other species, dabbling ducks that we've talked about or will talk about. They like seasonal wetlands. They like semi-permanent wetlands. Obviously, for brood rearing, you're going to need a wetland that's going to retain water throughout the breeding season, throughout that brood rearing season. Preferably one that has a good amount of emergent vegetation, maybe some submerged aquatic vegetation to provide a good forage base for the inverts that those little ducklings are going to be eating. So yeah, that kind of takes us to the brood rearing and fledging. And what next?
That kind of takes us right into fall, and we're going to talk about that.
They
that
do,
fall migration, really.
Yeah, so males do engage in a molt migration. There's
Okay.
some indication that they do that, and that's not going to be too uncommon across most species of ducks also. And it'll be most common or most prevalent for the males because they do not have any responsibility for caring for the broods, and so they will depart the female once she gets into incubation and go off and start molting and getting ready for that southward migration.
Yeah, and that's where the exciting part about green wings for me comes in, is because that's when you're starting to hunt them, and that's one of the species it's one of my favorite species to hunt. While it's difficult to really, specifically target green wings, I've always, when they're there, when they're not, and I think that has a lot to do with their fall migration. I mean, they're, obviously opportunistic feeding. But I personally, you mentioned you've had some dry field, sightings, I guess. I personally have never hunted green wings in any dry field. And I guess that was just surprising to me when you said that. I've typically hunted them in wetlands and even flooded agricultural fields like rice fields, things like that.
I don't know how common it would be to hunt them in dry fields, but I just know there's been documentation of them taking advantage of that.
Someone out there is going to start creating the full body, fully flocked field green wing teal decoy.
Our good friend Scott Stevens, Dr. Scott Stevens, has some green wing silhouettes, I believe, that he deploys.
I know he did
on
blue
the edge
wings.
Of the wetlands.
Did he do green wings? You'll have to ask him next time you get him on.
He's probably done about half a dozen or more species by now.
Yeah. So as we get into the fall migration, these birds are so widely distributed. But you kind of hinted at the point that there are some really, kind of hot spots for these birds. And one of them that really sticks out to me, and I'll just bring it up, is that Pacific Flyway, Central Valley, and also even over on Salt Lake. I've hunted them over there, and just clouds of green wings.
Yeah.
These things are fantastic. I mean, it's one of the most beautiful hunts I've ever been on. But you're seeing these massive, sometimes upwards of 10,000 green wings in one big ball. And I was talking to the guys out there, and they're feeding on that plankton in the Great Salt Lake. And we had some fantastic hunts. But what are some of the other hot spots that these green wings, throughout the winter, where people can kind of, I guess, meet the migration with green wings?
Yeah, well, so let's talk about the pace of the migration. I mentioned that their spring migration is a bit protracted, a bit drawn out. So is their fall migration. We have most states, well, many states have a early teal season, and you can harvest green wings in that early teal season. They're not terribly common in the bag. I think the harvest statistics I was looking at, around 40 or 50,000 green wings are harvested during that early teal season. So you can encounter them and you can harvest them, but their migration southward is a bit more drawn out and a bit delayed relative to blue wings.
Would you say that is with the green wings that are harvested, let's say in Louisiana or Texas during that early teal season, would those typically be, the more southern breeding green wings?
That's going to be my guess.
Yeah.
I don't know that for a fact. I think you could probably look at some band recovery data and get a feel for that, but I'm not up to speed on that. But yeah, that would make sense, and that would also explain why it's a bit more protracted, because these birds breed at more northern latitudes up in the boreal forest. They may get a little bit, the timing of breeding may be about average, but yeah, they're just their flexibility of diet just doesn't cause them to have to get out of the northern latitudes as quick as let's say a blue wing. In contrast there. So in terms of other areas, well, obviously you mentioned a couple of them there, but as we look, as you look through the Central Flyway and Mississippi Flyway, the Gulf Coast is going to be a very common, a very prolific destination for this species. I think some of the wetlands, large wetlands in what is it, Kansas? I'm drawing a blank here. Yeah, some of the wetlands in
Cheyenne Bottoms.
Yeah, that's
area.
the one I was thinking of. Some of those areas probably going to get a lot of green wings. Missouri's probably going to get a lot of green wings. You'll find them. They're a rather ubiquitous bird in terms of large concentrations, like what you mentioned. I think you're going to have to go to the Gulf Coast. There are probably a few of those other isolated wetlands that we've talked about, or not necessarily isolated, but significant wetlands that are going to hold large concentrations as well. Arkansas is going to support a large number, but they're not really a forested bird. You hunt timber a fair bit. You probably don't see many in the timber, do you?
Surprisingly, in traditional green timber, no. Very rarely. I mean, people do see them,
Yeah.
and a lot of that is because they've cut a big hole in the timber, and that larger. If you're in thick timber, like a real traditional mallard timber hunt, that they're pretty rare. But we've shot them in some of the larger holes, and then there's some of those smaller kind of transitional, not true green timber, but maybe some of the smaller trees with some of the buckbrush style. Those reservoirs in Arkansas hold some. So yeah, I mean, I've seen them in there, but it's not common. I mean, you're not gonna fill a strap with green wings typically on a traditional timber hunt. But that's where we see them in the rice fields more than anything down there. But then also, you get a lot of reports, and you can probably touch on the harvest data. In Chesapeake Bay in the Atlantic Flyway, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Shoots a lot of green wings too. So I guess this just
probably in those coastal environments.
Yeah.
Yeah. They do have an affinity for some of those tidal systems. That is one thing that is worth mentioning. That really shallow water, anywhere you can find really shallow water for these birds, and those tidal flats, it can be really good for green wings.
Yeah. And then I have buddies down in Florida, like even South Florida. They put a hurt on the green wings.
Yeah.
Those birds really want to get into like you said, it's a shallow, lots of submerged aquatics type habitat that they hunt in, and it's and they get a lot of them, but they tend to get them kind of late.
Yeah.
But I'm just assuming that's geography.
I have to imagine it would be pretty fun to try to shoot green wings descending into a timber hole.
Yeah. Just grip it and rip it.
Yeah,
they come flying through there. We've had that happen before. We have a small little area that is not a true timber hole. It's just kind of a bunch of tall weeds and stuff and some short trees, and they'll come into that thing, and it's a mess. I mean, it's I'd say 50% of the time that happens, we're watching a flock of mallards up high, and these green wings will just bomb in like 20 of them. All you hear is just wings.
Because they probably don't parachute in. They probably descend head first.
Yeah. And so I'd say 50% of the time we don't even get a shot. So, but it's always fun.
Yep. Let's see. Food habits. That's one of the things that we haven't talked about yet in terms of, especially during the winter, people want to know about that and how they can better manage their property. They're another one of these omnivorous duck species, meaning they eat both plant and animal. During the winter, during those migration, heavy energy demanding periods, their diet is going to be dominated by those foods that give them carbohydrates, which is going to be the plant-based materials, and that's seeds and a lot of seeds basically, and some other vegetation to go along with that. They do eat invertebrates. The breakdown from some of the studies that I've seen were about 60-40 plant-based to animal-based, and that plant-based, when I say plant-based, I'm talking about seeds, not just leaves and stems and things like that. It's mostly seeds, but it can be as high as 80-20 plant to animal. But of course, they need animal matter, and they need invertebrates and things of that nature as well. They need the little clams and clams, crustaceans, things of that nature.
Someone managing property saying, I want to create this habitat for green wings, I would think that one of the most important things to keep in mind is shallow.
You got to have the right water depth. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Super shallow. A lot of times you find pictures of green wings and they will be foraging in mud.
Yeah.
So it's like, man, how can they get anything off of it? They have lamellar spacing, the spacing of their little, they're called lamellae. They're the little tooth-like, the comb-like adaptations on the bills inside the mouths of these birds They're finely spaced in green wings, allowing them to filter out smaller seeds. Their green wings actually have an affinity for some of those really, really tiny seeds, sedges, cyperus seeds, and pigweed, and some of those other types of plants that are just like incredibly producing millions and millions of seeds, but just incredibly small. And so that's really good for green wings.
And that type of habitat would all be generated based upon more of a moist soil approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. Yep. Sparsely vegetated, you could say, but shallow and lots of weeds. And yeah, just a good shallow, seasonally flooded wetland with a good amount of vegetation in it.
Yeah. Let's talk about survival. The survival of these birds. And just throughout the season. I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is we've really had, similar to blue wings, the last 20 years has been pretty good for green-winged teal.
Yes, it has.
And in turn, very good for green-winged teal harvest numbers for waterfowl hunters.
Yep.
But survival overall, can you kind of touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we get our survival estimates from banding data.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've harvested a banded bird and reported that band, thank you. And encourage everyone to do that, as always. Maximum lifespan record for a green wing, I think there's actually a couple of them that are like really phenomenal records. One is like 20 and a half years, 20
Holy
years,
moly.
six months.
Yeah.
I don't know where that dude was hiding out. I don't even know if
Yeah.
it was a male or female, but wherever it was, it found the right place. And,
Yeah.
then I think there was another one like 25 years.
Wow.
Would be probably the one. That one might have actually been in Europe. I can't remember. I was reading that the other day. But
I would think that the smaller stature of that bird would lend itself to be, to not have the ability to even live that long.
That's right. That's typically
pretty amazing.
That's typically the way it goes. Smaller bodied animals typically have shorter lifespan. Larger bodied animals, and you can think about this on the spectrum. Think about elephants at the maximum end of this spectrum, or a manatee. These big whales. They're just really long-lived individuals. And of course, the smaller an animal is, the more that can eat it, the more susceptible it is to inclement weather and all sorts of things. So yes, the general rule is that the smaller an animal is, the shorter the lifespan, and that applies also, within taxonomic groupings. Average lifespan of a green wing is going to be shorter than that of a canvasback or a Canada goose or a swan. In terms of survival, annual survival, it ranges from about 40% up to 60%. Meaning that we're going to lose somewhere between 40 and 60. Well, I guess the math there's going to kind of make that confusing. But yeah, 40 to 60% annual survival. The juvenile females are going to come in on the low end of that survival range at about the 40, 45%. And the sex and age cohort that's going to have the greatest survival rate is going to be the adult males. And that's going to hold true pretty much across all waterfowl species, or at least all duck species. And in terms of harvest rates for this bird, we're looking at a pretty low harvest rate, surprisingly. It's somewhere between 3 and 5%.
Oh, wow.
So 3 and 5% based on some recent band recovery analyses that I saw. It's another persistent trend in harvest rates is going to be that juveniles are harvested at a higher rate than adults. One of the things that when you look at that analysis that I just referenced on harvest and survival rates over the 20 or 30 year period, harvest rate increased from the 90s at least through the about 2008, which was when that study kind of ended, that analysis ended. The maximum harvest rate during any given year that study estimated was around 8%. So still a harvest rate lower than what we typically see for most cohorts, age and sex cohorts of mallards. Those can get anywhere from like 6 to 12 or something of that nature. But yeah, green wings are harvested at a pretty low rate, but they do have a pretty low survival rate, as I mentioned, which tells you there's a fair bit of mortality outside of harvest.
Yeah. I could imagine the hawks and eagles and
there's also been some records of them succumbing to inclement weather, extreme weather, which again, smaller bodied individuals are just not going to be able to pack on as much reserves to withstand some of those really inclement weather conditions, and they may find themselves maybe more likely to find themselves in an energetic pinch.
Yeah,
I'd say.
and I think a good example of that is I saw some things online where this February when we had that real cold snap,
Yeah.
and it especially down here in Arkansas and North Louisiana, you get a cold snap and something freezes, but then it everything opens up by the next day or two. Where we had like 7 or 8 days,
Right.
where it was locked up, and I saw some videos online where there was pretty significant number of birds, green wings. They were showing images of green wings that had died on the ice.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And you see a dozen of them, maybe.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there were more.
Yeah.
They just a dozen of them. But I would imagine just their small size and their ability, their lack of ability to feed in that situation, really, and they're so small they don't have, the ability to migrate even further. You can have a difficult time getting down to the coast, things like that. So probably lends itself to that. But, another thing for that survival rate is, these are difficult birds to hit.
Yeah.
They're small, they're fast, very acrobatic, similar to a blue wing. And a lot of times they come in big flocks. I've noticed that especially where we hunt and kind of historically throughout my hunting experiences, when green wings are around, they're, dozen or more, I've seen flocks upwards of 200, 250 that'll dive bomb the decoys. And then it's a mess.
You got to be careful. It's another one of those where you got to pick your shot, right?
That's right. It's a mess for shooters, especially young and inexperienced shooters, because the targets are so small and there's so many of them. They're going everywhere, and you end up with boom, 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 and nothing.
Or else you boom, 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 and a whole bunch, and you start counting, and like, oh.
That is a good reminder. That is a very good reminder, because I have seen that where there's 2 or 3 guys hunting, and a big flock of green wings come in, and you just square them up,
and they ball up right at the last second.
And all of a sudden, as soon as they start hitting the water, you're like, we are counting birds right now to make sure everyone has the correct amount, and we're staying legal. So that does happen quite a bit too. A lot of misses, but when you do hit, you usually hit very, very well. Let's talk about the population status.
Before we do that, I have some harvest statistics here. So we talked about harvest rate, but harvest in terms of overall number of green wings harvested on average over, I think, like the past 20 or so years. It may not be going back that far. It's about 1.7 million harvested across the U.S.
That's a pretty high number.
It is. It accounts for 12% of total duck harvest, and right up there with Gadwall as number 2. Sort of year in and year out, those two are fighting back and forth for the second most harvested species. Probably over the past 20 years. You get past farther back than 20 years. I'm not sure how those numbers break out, but nevertheless, not uncommon for them to be the second most heavily harvested duck species in North America. About, as I mentioned at the outset, about 40,000 birds are harvested, green wings are harvested in September, in that September teal season. I don't know what the distribution of that harvest is. My guess is it's going to be in more northern states. I just don't know. Like that early harvest, I could probably get that data. But given that they're more protracted and slightly delayed migration, I would think there might be a bit more of a skew of that harvest occurring in some of the northern and mid-latitude states that have a September teal season. So then the residual of that, the remainder of that, the 1.68 or so, is going to occur in the regular duck season. They are the number 2 most harvested bird species in the Pacific flyway. And matter of fact, when you look at California, in some of the more recent years, they have been the number 1 most harvested bird. And there's a big story there as well. When you look back 20 or so years ago, pintails were the number 1 most harvested bird in California. And of course, that's no longer the case. We have some bag restrictions, and we've seen a decline in total pintail harvest. And then mallards took over as the number 1 harvested species in California. And then here over the past few years, we've actually seen green-winged teal be the most heavily harvested species in California. And there's one county out there, Merced County, that probably leads all counties in North America and in the U.S. in terms of green wing harvest. I think I have that county right, but it's one of those Sac Valley counties.
Just hammering on the green wings out there.
Yeah.
But I think that also, and that those numbers are high, and very significant for waterfowlers, But I think it also lends itself to, I've been in situations where, when you do have green wings, and especially in the Mississippi flyway,
it's hard to pass them up.
You can shoot 6 of them. So, it's like, all right.
It's hard to pass
We're
them up.
We're going to do this. We're going to do it.
Unless you know you have good prospects for mallards or pintails. Or
That's
of course,
right.
Pintails, you can't shoot very many of those.
Yeah,
so
I mean, you're at one there.
And
so, and I think that lends itself to, because, we've done that a couple years back in Arkansas. Everybody in Arkansas wants to shoot mallards. I mean, it's the greenhead's the name of the game, but I'm perfectly fine, shooting my 6 green wings and going back to camp. So, I think that also lends itself to that higher harvest rates.
Which state do you think is responsible for the greatest green wing harvest? Only like 2 or 3 logical choices.
Yeah, I'm gonna say Utah.
No,
you don't think?
No, it's California.
Oh,
well, California or Louisiana. Those have kind of fought it out back and forth here over the past few years for 1 or 2.
I think Utah would be. There's just not a lot of people hunting out there.
Yeah, you're probably right. Right. If they had more pressure, you're probably right.
I bet if you compared it to 100 days of field,
see, there you go.
Harvest.
Trying to find a way to make your comment be correct.
Yeah, I am.
It's always a way to adjust something.
And I'll be honest, I was a bonehead move on my part, because if anyone ever asks what's the number 1 state for any duck harvested, you always say California, Texas, or Louisiana. Like that's it.
Or Arkansas.
Yeah. In the past, yes. Yeah. But if anyone ever asks you those questions, always guess those 3 or 4 states, and you're probably right around there.
Yep. In terms of where the majority of green wing harvest occurs, it's in the Mississippi flyway. Despite what I just said about California being number 1 in terms of states, 45% of the harvest of green wings occurs on average in the Mississippi flyway. That's going to capture the Louisiana, the Arkansas, the Missouri. Those. I don't know what the harvest is in Texas. I didn't grab that number, but it's going to be in several 100,000.
Yeah,
I would say
it's got to be high.
Let's see. I think that's all I have on harvest statistics. So
yeah, let's. Well, then, that being the case, let's go ahead and transition into, the conservation efforts and population status. We can talk about that. I'm sure you have those numbers pretty handy. I know we haven't had the BPOP for a couple years, but we have some data that you can provide.
I do. I pulled some numbers here, and over the past 10 years, we have averaged about 3.5 million green wings in the breeding population in the traditional survey area. That's going to be basically west of the Great Lakes states. The traditional survey area, the prairies, the parklands, the western boreal forest into Alaska. You're going to add a few 100,000 maybe once you look into some of the western states, California, Intermountain West, Oregon, Washington, maybe interior British Columbia. You'll add a few 100,000 there, but most of those are going to occur in Alaska and the western boreal forest. What I don't know, I don't have the numbers broken out separately for Alaska versus the western boreal forest and the prairies and parklands. It's interesting when you look at where those birds go. If you look at the birds in Alaska, the majority of those are going to go down to the Pacific Flyway. But there is an interesting migration corridor for green wings coming out of the prairies to go into the Pacific Flyway by way of Utah through the Great Salt Lake. I forget what is 20 or so % of some of those in Alberta and Saskatchewan, or maybe about 20% in Saskatchewan, will actually make their way to the Pacific Flyway via the Salt Lake. So there's some interesting migration patterns there. You add about 500,000 green wings in the breeding population in eastern Canada and the northeastern U.S. Not a whole lot in the northeastern U.S. Most of those are going to occur naturally, as you would expect, in the boreal forest of eastern Canada. They are the 5th most abundant species, breeding population-wise. I actually thought they might be, when I get to looking into the number, I thought they might be higher than that. But they're right up there with, I think, shoveler. Kind of over the past 10 years, they're about that same, or maybe I'm thinking, anyway, shoveler, scaup, gadwall, they're right there, kind of fluctuating around that 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5 range. The peak in recent years is about 4.2 million, and that came in 2016. That's going to be a mid-continent estimate, traditional survey area estimate. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan goal for this species is 2.1 million. So we have been above the NAWAMP goal for green-winged teal for quite some time, and we continue to be so. They're a species that has shown a long-term increase since basically the mid-'80s. It will be interesting to see what the population size is once we get back up in the air and start flying again. That's the collective we of the waterfowl management community, but they are a species that's doing well in terms of conservation concern. I think we have to look. Well, I mean, naturally, we look to the prairies in terms of ongoing grassland conversion and wetland loss. That's always going to be a concern given kind of where we are with things. But the majority of this population breeds in the western boreal forest, so that's where we look for that, and then into Alaska a little bit. But if we look in the western boreal forest, it's such an important place for this species. We have to think about some of the ongoing pressures and stresses that are affecting that landscape, and that includes some of the oil and gas extraction. That includes some of the forestry that's occurring in those landscapes, and that's why we in Ducks Unlimited, and really our partners up north of the border, Ducks Unlimited Canada, are putting such a strong emphasis on some work in the boreal forest to ensure sustainable practices, sustainable harvest practices, and just working with all the partners that depend on that landscape to see if we can find the right balance between utilizing the resources that it provides to humankind, but then also ensuring that we do so in a way that will continue to meet the needs of the birds and all the other critters that depend on it. And so that's really one of the areas of concern. But nevertheless, green wings have persisted and have succeeded across that landscape in recent years, but we'll continue to keep an eye on that through a lot of the work that we do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think what's one thing to keep in mind is, I think you mentioned the 30% in the prairies, the breeding numbers, that other 70% is, across the boreal. Yeah. And as we sit here in 2021, that makes a lot bigger difference because of the ongoing drought, the drought that's going on. So this species is unique and that is a little more, I would say, drought resistant.
Is
that safe to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a good point. This may be a year where maybe in some years when you get some of those early flights of green wings, you might hold off on them, waiting out the mallards or some of the larger ducks later on in the morning. This might be one of those years where you don't want to do that. Take advantage of the production that we think probably occurred with green wings and other boreal nesting species, because Fritz Reed was telling us how conditions were pretty darn good up there. And so hopefully the green wings and other species up there took advantage of it. And hopefully we're going to see a lot of those make their way south here. So enjoy them in terms of, by enjoying, we have to kind of close out here. I think we may be close to closing out.
Yeah, we're getting there.
Table fair.
Yeah, that's.
Are we ready to go there?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing that I have on my list as you go through your taxonomy and distribution and all your data, and I'm over here like, let's eat them birds. Yeah. No, green wings are probably one of my favorite. They're awesome to pluck. And you can do anything with them. It's one of those birds that is not. I guess I would say that it's not as rich. It doesn't have as rich of a flavor as some other species, and it's very mild. I use a lot of green wings to introduce people to waterfowl, making maybe even some green wing tacos, things like that. That's always a success. And I just
they're great for roasting whole as well.
Absolutely, that's what I'm saying. Pluck them, roast them whole. They're one of those birds that I probably would not normally put in like a gumbo, or something like that. No. This is something that when we're plucking green wings, that's something that I have a plan.
It's
for
a
these
taste
birds.
Worth identifying and knowing that's what you're eating.
That's exactly really, really right. Great. Yeah, it's awesome. And hey, one more thing before we get out.
Probably don't even want to put them in little duck poppers either, do you?
No.
Save the shovelers or maybe some gadwall. Gadwall aren't too bad themselves.
No,
but
I mean any duck, you can do whatever you want to with any duck. I just prefer green wings.
Yeah,
whole. Or at least even whole breast with skin on. That's a good approach.
So if you're tempted, so I guess the take home there, if any of you harvest your 6 green wings this winter, if you're tempted to put those in some duck poppers, take a moment to pause and think about a different way of doing it.
Yeah, we've got some slow roasted duck recipes on ducks.org that you should probably check out.
Definitely. Green wings is the species worth doing that with.
Yep. My last thing, before we get out of here, I just want to remind all of our listeners, one thing that during the hunting season, when we're in the blind and I'm hunting with some of my buddies, typically when we call the shot on green wings, big clouds of green wings, you don't even say take them. You just say, pick a bird, pick a bird. Keep that barrel on one bird and take your shot because they can be humbling. So
yeah, absolutely.
All right, Mike, I appreciate you coming on today with me and talking green wings. I think everyone's probably picked up a little bit about this very unique species, including that they got to just whole roast them.
That's right. I love to do it. It's a great bird to talk about. It's a beautiful bird in so many respects. Such a small bird, but has so many unique aspects about it. So yeah, admire it, enjoy it for what it is. A great bird.
Awesome. I'd like to thank my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher, for coming on the podcast and talking about green-winged teal. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.